Hi, everybody. This is Diana Gray. I'm the UiPath Community Marketing Manager for America. And welcome to tonight's session. We have a great team here that Tracy will introduce. But I just had a few words I wanted to say. One is if you could just put your questions in chat during the presentation. And another thing is that on December 12th, this is Series 2, but on December I believe it's 9th, we're going to have a session too that just describes the community, what we hope to do with the veterans chapter moving forward. So at the fourth session, we will be going more into that. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing then and how we'll be extending this program out through next year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy to introduce the team.
All right, so thanks for joining us, everybody, and thank you again for your service and being part of this and joining us. We always love it when you guys ask us lots of questions and participate because we'd love to give back to the automation community and to give you some skills that you can take into the rest of the world with you going forward. So first up today is Mason. So this is an MVP team today. All four of us are part of the UiPath MVP community, which just means that we love to help other people and talk about automation so we can give you some time back to do more important things. So first up today is Mason, who's been an MVP for a couple of years now. He's going to talk to you guys about variables and arguments. We're also going to get into some hands-on use cases. We have a lot of content. So we always love it. If you don't get to everything today or want to review things again, for you to reach out in the UiPath community to us after this session. We're always happy to help. And then we're also going to get into control flow, which means how an automation proceeds through which direction it's going. It can be through multiple paths. So we'll talk more about that and do some hands-on exercises with that too. So with that said, here's a quick overview of the agenda, and we've got a lot of content, so we're going to dig in. Mason, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, sounds good.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so just a quick intro into variables and arguments into UiPath. So variables are the places that we store data. It's how we label and store it and can be later used throughout the automation process. Um, they have an initial value that can change during the program. And that you can interact with those through different activities, like an assign activity. Most activities will have something in the properties panel that you can put data into a variable. It's like a box that stores data. Tracy, if you want to go to the next slide. So there's some properties of a variable. So this is basically what a variable is. So a variable is going to have a name. It's going to have a type, that's the type of data that it can store. It's going to have a value, so that's the actual data that's stored within the variable. And then there's this concept of a scope, which is if we have multiple containers, so like sequences nested. Andres is going to talk a little bit more about that, but when we have nested sequences, variables are scoped to one sequence. So they exist within the sequence that they're scoped to. So some best practices for naming variables. We want to use clear and meaningful names. Assign those names in a consistent manner. Use camel case to name your variables. So camel case is the first letter of each word is capitalized. And keep your names descriptive yet short. So we want to keep them fairly short so that they're readable, but we want them to be descriptive enough that we know what they're talking about. Try not to use abbreviations or anything. Try to use full words. And then try to use one or two or three words. So there's different types of variables. So a variable can be any type that's in C#, but these are the most common ones that you'll see. Strings are like character arrays. So when you think of a word, that is a string. Any word in the English language, or you could have a word with spaces. Pretty much any type of character that you can type in your keyboard can be stored in a string. A Boolean is true, false, so it's like a binary 0, 1, yes, no kind of thing. So we can store that type of value in a variable as well. There are different types of numbers. So there's integers, which can store just like an integer, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's decimal types that can store decimals. So you'd have like 10.5 or whatever. And so you can store those in different number types. And then there's date and time. So that one we can store pretty self-explanatory, the date and the time. And then there's a data table type. And that data table type stores rows and columns of data. And this one you'll see a lot. It's kind of like an Excel sheet, right? If you think that you have your different rows and your different columns in Excel, the data table is actually storing that data in the rows. And you use the columns to figure out which field you want to get out of which row. And then queue items are specific to UiPath. So a queue item is when our robots are processing transactions. Each queue item represents one unit of work that the process will be working on. So a queue item, if you're processing invoices, a queue item might be one invoice. You kind of have free reign to determine what a queue item represents, but they have different fields inside of them, like a reference, so like a title, and then they have specific content to store other data types, kind of like a dictionary or a data table. And then yeah, it has like a postponed date, there's like a created on date, there's all this data that's stored with the queue item, and then there's activities that you can use to interact with the queue item, like create queue items, process a transaction, take down a single transaction. You can get queue items, so you can get hundreds of queue items from a queue up in UiPath. And then the last type that we'll talk about is an array. This is, if you think about it as like a list of different types. So say we have a string is actually a character array. So it's like an array of characters, right? So like the letter C, the letter A, those are different characters, and a string is like a combination of those. But you can do that same thing with other data types. So I could have an array of numbers where I could store 1, 2, 3 all at the same time in one variable in an array. I could do that with Booleans as well. I could store true, false, true within that array. I could store multiple dates and times, yada, yada. I could create an array of arrays or an array of data tables. Those would be very interesting use cases, but you could do that. So you can put whatever type you want into an array. All right, so arguments are a little bit different than variables. Arguments are used to pass data from one workflow to another. So we were talking about sequences, but when you break a sequence out into a different file in UiPath, you kind of treat that as like a function. Arguments are used to pass that data into that file. So they enable you to reuse your workflows. So you can create a workflow and use the arguments as the input and output, store that data dynamically. And it's useful when you get larger automation projects where you need to break functionality out into separate pieces and reuse it. So you can just call your workflows over and over again. So arguments they're fairly the same as variables, except they add a new layer, which are the direction. So you can have an argument that's into a workflow, an argument that's coming out of a workflow, or you can have an argument that's going in and out. So those are all three options that you can have with arguments, but they can still store the same types and everything as variables. So they're very much like variables, but then they also have this concept of a direction with them. All right, so arguments versus variables. So argument stores data and passes it between workflows. Variables stores data and passes them between activities within the workflow. So activities are going to be inside your workflow, and then your workflows are the actual files. And the arguments are going to go into those workflows, and they can be used within the activities, just like a variable, but a variable only exists within that workflow. And, oh, go back again, Tracy, I wasn't done on that slide. So they're both created through a panel at the bottom of the screen, which I'll show in a little bit. They're created and modified through the arguments and the variables panel, respectively. And so arguments have these different fields about them. They have a name, direction, type, and a default value. And a variable is going to have a name, type, scope, and default value. All right. And then let's see. I'm going to show, do you mind if I take over sharing screen,
There you
Tracy?
go.
I'm just going to show in Studio where these things live very quickly. So right now I have a sequence that's my main sequence. I have an assign here. My variables live down here in this variables tray. This is the variables panel. And I can create variables here. I could create a variable named name, call it a string. This is where I can set the type. So I can set Boolean, int32, string. And I can browse for types, so I can use any type that's loaded into C#. I can set the scope. So if I had a different sequence here, we'll call that sequence scope. I could set the scope to that, and so this variable won't exist outside of here. So let's use it here. Let's say my name equals Mason. So I'm using it in this assign. If I use this scope to set it inside of here, it's going to give me a validation error because it only exists in here. If I drop this assign in there, we're good. But if I take it outside of there, now it only exists there. And if I click here, then it comes back up, right? So if I click here, my variable's gone. When I click here, it comes back up. So that's what the scope does. And then we can also set a default value. So I can do the same thing that I did here in this assign. I can give it a string value and then change it. Maybe I wanted to change it to Mason T as I was in here. So that's variables. And then arguments come into play over here in the arguments tab. So I can create an argument using this. And we always create an argument with the prefix in, out, or IO, depending on if it's an in, out, or in, out argument. So we could do in last name, right? We can give it a direction, in, out, or in, out. And we can also give it the same types as we could with variables. With an in, we can give it a default. With in and in, out, we can give a default value. Sorry, just with in, we can give a default value. And then with out and in, out, we cannot give a default value. The reason is because when we invoke this workflow, and I'll show what that looks like as well. So we're going to invoke this main workflow that I have and refresh our arguments real quick. Oh, I need to save it. There we go. So now it pulls in our arguments. And so we can give it a value in, but on the way out, we have to assign it to a variable or another argument. So we can't give it a default value. And so this is what it looks like when you're invoking a workflow, and these are the arguments. So now you're going to pass data into that workflow, and it's calling this one as if it was a function, right? And so that's how variables and arguments work. All right. And that's it for arguments and variables. Tracy, if you want to take back over.
Sorry, it's not wanting to acquiesce. Give me just a second.
Yep.
It'll yield at some point. Let me know when you guys can see it. It thinks it's trying now.
Oh,
All right, you able to see?
yeah, we can see now.
Okay, perfect. So next up is Andres, who's going to talk to you guys about sequences and flowcharts.
Hi all, thank you so much for your service. I'm here to explain a little bit about sequences and flowcharts in Studio. So Studio is what's known as a low-code platform. So these structures sort of represent flow of execution, which is a concept in programming where, you know, the first statement happens first and the second statement happens next. And basically UiPath has two different flavors in which you can visualize that. one of which is a sequence and the other one is a flowchart. So the simplest one is a sequence, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. Each thing you do immediately is followed by the next thing. There's just a straight line down. There are activities or boxes that you can use to have branching paths. So you can have like an if statement inside of a sequence. So if you see on the picture here, this is a simple sequence that just, the first thing it does is input dialogue. It asks you for your name, and then it asks you for your age, and then it spits that back out at you in order, 1, 2, 3. You can put an if statement inside of a sequence. For example, it says if your name is John, then you say something specific that only John would know, or if your name is something else, then the message might be more generic, like, oh, I don't know you, or something like that. So there is the option to put a box in here that splits this so that it's not a simple step 1, step 2, step 3. It could be step 1, step 2, then maybe step 3, or a different alternate step 3. But it gets very convoluted in this sort of visualization of it. There is also, what do you call it? It just gets really cluttered if you're trying to do that more than once. So if you have like, if your name is John, then you have to check their last name too. Then you start sort of building this pyramid of boxes when you start nesting ifs inside of each other. So this sort of visualization of execution, flow of execution, the order of steps that we take and which paths we take, this visualization doesn't lend itself well to complicated logic. So it's best used for the simplest scenario where, step 1 follows step 2 follows step 3, with, some leeway for putting just one if statement in there so that it doesn't look too messy. Now, if you want to go crazy and you have a lot of branching paths and you want to represent some really complex logic that has a lot of different options to go to, that's when you would use a flowchart. So if you see here on the screen, this is actually a pretty simple flowchart, where someone enters their age, for example, and if they're less than 18, then it'll go to, tell you something specific about being under 18. Maybe you're not allowed to use this website. If you're 18 to 25, it goes to some other piece of logic that is only specific to 18 to 25-year-olds, and older than 25 likewise. The thing about flowcharts, and I'm just going to share my screen for 1 second, is that, again, that's a really simple example there. Second. Okay. Let me know when you guys can see my screen. I'm just going to do a new flowchart here. Show you where this sort of comes from. So it has this sort of graphical interface where you actually can kind of go crazy and say, workflow, if, for example, you can start writing all of these different branching paths, and you can really write a really crazy piece of logic if, I don't know if this makes sense, if I'm explaining myself well, but doing this in a sequence would really blow up the size of the automation. Like if I was to go and put ifs into the sequence, then put another if inside of here, it gets really tricky to sort of figure this out. So this if with an if inside of it is represented like so, if with an if inside of it, and then this can then have, different branching paths, which just looks a lot cleaner, is the idea. And then you can go back to the presentation.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Excellent.
so it enables you to create more complex sort of logic and still visually be able to understand what's happening. So sequences are suitable for linear processes and are more of like a, you know, the simpler option, whereas flowcharts are more for complex things that might require branching into different logic paths. And then I think it's pretty clear when to use one or another. What do you call it?
I would caution anybody to try to, these can get complicated, so you have to be able to figure out what happened and where you're going. So only use them when you need to, when there are scenarios that dictate that you have to do that, because you have to be able to follow it, and every single path you have to do work for. So be as simple as possible, but they're here for you if you need to get into something complicated.
Right, wait, and actually I'm seeing some questions in the chat. So I understand nested if shouldn't be used in a sequence, instead switch or case. Would switch or case be used in workflows as well? Yeah, so you have switch statements in both sequences.
And they're
and-
coming up soon, so you guys will get to see more of that.
Okay, oh yeah, so that they're later in the presentation, you'll see more of that as well, the switch statements. So you are able to use both. However, switch statements don't really represent the sort of nested logic that an if following an if follows. And so switch statement is more just like it's one of these many options. And then there are templates for all sorts of stuff that you can use in the UiPath marketplace. I guess the most common template that uses something similar to a flowchart, but slightly more complicated, called the state machine, would be the RE framework, which is really, once you get into learning about the RE framework, that's sort of like the template that most business processes use in industry. So anytime you go to a company that uses UiPath, most of their processes will be built on this specific template. And yeah, so you could start it from scratch like I just showed, or you could use one of the many templates on the marketplace like Naveen just explained in chat. Okay, and then this is just again when to use a sequence and when to use a flowchart. But if we go to the next slide, then we see something even more interesting, which is that you can do both. You can put sequences inside of a flowchart. So if you want to do something more than like an atomic action based off a flow decision, then you can put a sequence that takes a long series of steps based on it falling onto one of the many branching paths of the logic. And yeah, so you can do some really powerful stuff inside of a flowchart. But like Tracy said, be careful, don't go too crazy. Someone still has to come back in and understand what you're doing. I've seen some really, really insane flowcharts that look like the Hydra from the Odyssey. So don't do that.
And
Have fun.
all right. I think there's a little bit more on a couple more slides, or this one more slide on flowcharts. Anything further you wanted to cover that you haven't already on that one, Andres?
No, I mean, I think it's basically the same explanation. Again, it's a different way of visualizing the logic. So in theory, you could write equivalent logic using a sequence or a flowchart. But just a flowchart gives you a completely different visual presentation that lends itself better to more complex branching logical paths.
There you go. All right. Any questions? Feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll be happy to address those. So now let's talk control flow. So you talked about the overall structure and the types of things that you could use, the variables and arguments that you can use to represent different pieces of information throughout. So this is really about the way that you can move through the steps and whatever you need to create. So control flow, kind of like you learned math years ago, and which things got done in which order. This is the flow of the things that are happening in the automation, and how you can expect one thing to happen, what types of things There are that you have to choose from, which ones are used in certain scenarios versus others. So we'll get into more details about this. There's a lot of stuff in here. The best way to learn these is to build things and get used to the different types, and you'll learn them really well over time. So there are two major types. So just like you were asking before, the switch activities and if activities, decision-based, you'll also hear them called conditionals. That's when you've got some scenarios and you have to pick a direction to go, a decision point to make, which could be something like a couple of, it's either one or the other, which is where you typically would use an if statement. Then switch activities tend to be where there's often more than one option, or even like a this, and then everything else falls in this bucket. Those types of things where there's a number of different options, which can get really, really messy if you're doing, looking at just two at a time. And so switch gives you the ability to lay those out in order where it's easier to follow all of that logic as a group together. So we'll look at examples of both of those. And then what we would call iteration based, which really just means a loop. Could be a loop of no things or one thing where it's done with pretty quickly, or it could be a loop of 1,000 things where it's going through the same set of things and performing some action on them again and again based on whatever logic you've got laid out. So we'll dig into both of those. All right, and so we talked about decision control and the two major types. This is an example of an if activity. Really, it is if this one thing occurs, and you guys can see.
Off into a corner like a coyote. I've seen so many coyotes when we're walking at night.
Really?
Yeah.
Is there someone in this place?
I don't know. You tell me.
We've got to mute
What's
some.
going on? UiPath. Go, go, go.
There's do you guys hear audio?
Yeah.
No?
Someone
It's
might
like-
have a
Somebody
call at
put
once,
themselves on mute.
I may have to drag it off like a coyote.
Lauren, please mute
There's
yourself.
tons of them in it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a if statement, so conditional. You've got, in this case, it's just two choices. For me personally, I always put an annotation at the top of any if activity, which is what you guys see here that says confirm and process. Before I ever write it, I put the two choices of what I'm supposed to do, because it's really easy to get deep into something and figuring out the logic of it and get it all typed out properly, and then forget which one's true or which one's false, or what you're doing exactly or why you're doing it. So for me, and to explain better to the person that might be coming in behind me to look at this or to understand it, I always will put what in the world each of the directions are supposed to mean. So typically that's true and false is how these if statements evaluate. So in this example, I have something at the beginning of one of my automations that confirms the settings that I've chosen. It pops those up on screen, says, are they correct? I can say yes or no. If I chose yes, then I want it to go ahead and proceed. If I chose no, it meant that my settings were wrong and I don't want it to do anything at all. So I lay that out at the beginning before I ever put any of the logic in there and build anything further out. That way it's really easy to remember what in the world I intended to happen before it actually happens, which is a good practice to get into, to think about what you're going to do before you do it whenever you start to build an automation, because it's really easy to get deep in the logic and get lost as to what you're trying to accomplish with something. But always good to have a plan before you get going. So in this case, there's this just has the then. So if this one thing happens, if this is true, then do this. In this particular case, I didn't need anything to happen if it wasn't true. There's also the variety where I might want a whole different set of activities to happen if it's false. And so there could be another box. It just remains blank in this case, where I could have it do something different. Maybe I want to log something that says the settings are wrong, stop the automation, or don't do anything further, adjust your settings, rerun the program, that type of thing. So that's an if where you've got a true or false scenario. You pick what true and false means. There's typically, I would suggest that the default for true would be the thing that happens most often. On switch activity, this is where you can get a little bit more complicated, where you can list a number of things. In this case, it is numbers where I've chosen an integer type of switch. And we have a certain set of things that will happen if one is chosen over 2, over 3, and so on. It could be really anything, strings. It could be, if you selected apples, maybe I'm printing shipping labels for apples. Well, maybe I'll get choices for the different types of apples if that's what was selected. If it was oranges, then I'd get a whole different set of choices and so on. You can see how if you were just comparing 2 things at a time, it would get really complicated really fast and would be hard to lay that all out separately. So this works better if you've got a group of different items and you want to pick from amongst that group. So just to summarize the two, if is typically a decision point, the one direction or the other, that yes or no, true or false, that type of thing. If you want the true thing to happen, that's put in that first box, which is the then portion. Else would be if it's not true. So typically false, sometimes other things at 0, 1, but else would be the other things that could happen, but can also be left blank in some cases if you don't need anything in particular to occur. And then the switch is there for being able to test numerous types of values, which could be numbers, could be strings, could be other things. And then you put that information out there and then are able to specify a different set of activities. So in that case, by the way, just on the switch statement specifically, what you're putting in each of the sections is what that particular string or number equals. So it's not going to be the right thing to say greater than or equal to 1 or less than 0 or anything like that. Those wouldn't be the common uses or wouldn't be the use case for the switch statement. You would need to use a different type of activity in that case most often, and if. There is also an activity that's if, then, and else if, where you can have not just the 2 choices, but start to lay other things out. You always want to be judicious when you get into logic like this about debugging it and somebody coming in after you. So of course, limit the amount of that to just whatever's necessary and make sure you think through it well before you start laying those activities out. You guys have already learned about flowcharts a bit. You can just see those in place where you can see what the graphics might look like related to that, where you're looking at a decision point, which is two different directions that you can go from one decision, or a switch statement where you might be able to choose from a number of different options that can be a whole lot more complicated. And then we'll talk a bit about loops. So loops are where you may need to do the same thing again and again. So instead of you writing the logic numerous times, you would write logic for a given thing one time and then specify when you would want that to happen. So you don't have to write it again and again. You can have the same thing performed and then you write information within that loop. So it evaluates some given condition and you specify how many times that looping occurs based on whatever the conditions are. So in this case, this has got some of the decision structure we talked about before, where it starts. We want it to do something exactly 10 times. It counts through 1 to 10. If it's still less than 10, between that 1 and 10, it will continue on. If it's not, if it gets to number 11, we've already specified that we want it to happen just 10 times, then it won't carry on any further. It will stop at that. So that the condition would have been that we have it happening 10 times, 1 to 10. So that's one example, pretty simple one. The major types of loops are do while, which means, so the do part means it's happening at least once, no matter what. And then after it's happened the one time, then that condition that you specify is going to be evaluated, and it might proceed further, or it might already meet the condition and stop then after just the once. The while is similar, but it doesn't have that requirement that the one loop is gone through. So you may have something that says, if it's, I want this to happen, if it's less than 10, you may have started out with number 11. It'll never occur. If your number is number 11 at the beginning and it's a while loop, it will never go through whatever activity you have prepared for it, even the one time. And then in the case of for each, you typically have a collection of things. It could be for each of the fruits in your basket, or strings in an array, whatever the group of things is. Sometimes that's a group of none. You've got 0 in there. Nobody put anything in the cart today. Sometimes it could be many things, but it will go through that group of items that you have and perform some type of activity that you prepared on all of those within the group that you've already got collected. And that can be just about any type of thing. It could be numbers, it could be strings, it could be objects, like things that we talked about before, like queue items and so on. But you don't have to know the number that you have, or don't have to collect a particular count of things beforehand. It will go through all of that with whatever is sitting there. One thing you do have to be careful when you're looping through, especially if you're changing stuff within it. Sometimes you might, every time you go through the cart of groceries once, you might want to give away something out of the basket, that type of thing. You do have to be very careful about that because the looping can get confused about the amount of stuff in the basket. So you have to be very particular in the way that you handle those if you're changing that list of things at all within it. So just more information on what that do while looks like. You can see the condition is at the bottom. So we know it's going to go through and do the thing one time. It will look at the bottom, evaluate the condition, and then decide whether or not it will proceed. Where with the while, it's at the top. So it will evaluate that condition at the very start, and it may never do it to start with, just depending on whether the condition is met or not. Andres, and Naveen, anything that needed to be addressed in chat? Are we good there? You guys got it covered?
Yeah, I think we got it covered.
All right. This is just an example of the for each. In this case, this is a list of files. So pretty common for you to need to go look at a given folder. And so maybe you've got Excel spreadsheets that you're doing something for, or submitting them to the accounting office. You can have it go out, read that directory. Who knows how many files may be out there? Just depends on whatever occurred during the day. We'll go out and read those things. Whatever it finds, it'll perform the activity that is indicated. In this case, you're just writing something. It looks like just the name of or some information on the item, writing that out for you to see. Maybe you've got the file name in there for each one, so you can see what might be in the folder. And it will carry on and repeat that again and again until it gets to the end of the list. All right, and a few other things that will impact what's happening in your automation, what things will happen and what won't. So we'll kind of zoom through these, but there are a few different types. So delay would be where you're intentionally putting a bit of a pause in whatever you're doing. So wouldn't necessarily recommend doing these often. It's more when you see that automation might be zooming through too fast, and maybe there's an app that can't quite catch up. Sometimes you'll add a delay in there. In this case, it would be the number that you see represented there would be 20 seconds. You put that little time span in, and it'll automatically sit there that length of time that you indicate, giving you the ability to let the other things catch up if it was moving along too fast. So wouldn't normally recommend adding any of those unless you see that there's an issue and you're running into problems because some pieces of the automation want to move ahead too quickly. So generally, if you're taking up extra time for the robot with delays, that's something that costs you licensing time. You always want to do things as quickly as possible. So only use those whenever you know that you need them because it's moving along too fast for something. So break would be in the case that you're within one of those loops that we talked about before. This is the break activity specific to an iteration. So a loop and you need it to stop at a given point. So maybe you want it to go through all of the groceries, but maybe you want something super special to happen if there's ice cream that's encountered. You could specify something like that within the loop, even though it's, you know, got a whole grocery cart of items, and maybe handle that differently and kind of break out of what you're planning to do otherwise. You can give special logic for that. So the assign activity is really probably one of the most common that you'll use. So we talked about variables and arguments before. That would be when you're assigning a value to a given variable or argument. It can be a set amount like one. It could be something like this variable where you're making it one more than it was before. Either way, and then you can also assign things like objects. You could make an object, assign it a piece of mail, email, or a file order, or things like that, but very common, and you guys will be doing lots of assign statements. Parallel activities are my favorite, for sure. There's actually a parallel loop activity as well. And so I talked a little bit about robot time being like, you know, time is money. You're spending time building the automation is spending time doing the things that you don't want to do every day. And so the longer time that it takes to do things, well, the more of that robot is consumed, and the less time it will have for you to automate other processes. So you always want to minimize the length of time that it's spent doing things if possible. Parallel activities allow you to take and do some things at the same time, where it can benefit, like, you know, squeeze kind of the extra juice out of the processing power of the machine, and as much as possible, it can go out and do a number of things as close to the same time as possible. So we as humans can't go read all of the things on the screen and grab them and store them in our brains at the same time, but a robot can. So when I build things, a lot of times I'll put those things into a parallel activity at the end. That way they're processing as quickly as possible at the same time, as opposed to having to do things one after the other, where it has to wait on the activity before it to complete, before it moves on, and so on. In this case, it would be doing all four of these things, typing in the things at the same time, where you're taking advantage of that special capability that the robot has to do multiple things, or to read multiple things, or perform multiple activities at the same time. Not everything can always be done in a parallel activity where it's truly parallel, but we don't really have to know that. It will, if it can't do everything at the same time, it'll do it as quickly as it can, one after the other. So we don't have to worry about the types of things that we can and can't put in there. It will still tend to process faster in this type of thing. Now, not necessarily ideal for a loop where, say, you have 10,000 items, you know, it performing 10,000 things at the same time, probably not going to happen and could get really bogged down. So you do have to be careful about that. But especially when you're doing things that are time sensitive, where you don't have a lot of time. I know the first automation I built, it was for hospice patients, where time was very critical to get the things done very quickly, and to get communications out to the family and whatnot, and get providers helping them. So of course we were jumping on that and wanting things to happen as just as quickly as they could. So parallel activities can help you to do that. It can be a little confusing to jump around a bit because they don't necessarily, they will process from right to left, and it'll go back and forth. If there's a sequence of activities, it will zig and zag between them. So definitely recommend doing that more toward the end after you have things working properly, because it can be a little hard to debug when you see things zipping back and forth, and they don't necessarily follow a given sequence. And then continue, that's something that you can add inside your loop, where it can skip the remaining steps that you have in place depending on the scenario, and continue processing within that loop at the same time without having to break out of it. So I know that's a lot. You don't have to memorize these things. Fortunately, there's plenty of documentation and plenty of folks to help. We've got 3 million people in the community. A lot of us love to give time back and help other people. So if you get stuck, if you're not sure which of these things to use, then definitely reach out. That's what we're here for. We don't want anybody stuck spinning their wheels and not able to understand anything. So we're always happy for you to reach out and ask for help. So I'm gonna hand it over to Naveen, who's gonna let you guys do some hands-on activities and see some more things in action.
Yep, thanks, Tracy. And thanks everyone for joining. So let me share my screen.
There you go.
All right, I know we are having 10 more minutes, but I'll see how much we can cover here. So previously, as Tracy mentioned about the conditional statements and the looping statements. So I'll try to build some exercises here with you, the classroom exercises. So let's try to build an if, let's try to use the if activity and build a simple classroom exercise. So I would like to see within the given marks, whether the student is passed the exam or whether he has failed the exam. So for that, I would like to consider this. I would like to ask get the input dialog, get the input from the user. So I will use a input dialog activity here. So the good thing about UiPath is once you try to create a project, it will give you the sequence automatically. If you don't want to use a sequence and use the flowchart as we discussed previously, you can just type in flowchart from here and you can just drag and drop it to this. And other thing is either you can just drag and drop the activities from here, or you can click the plus icon whenever that is available, and you get the same kind of activities pane. You can search for the activity and drag and drop here. So as we went forward and tried this input dialog, I would like to give an input dialog title saying that user marks to be taken. And the label on the input label on the dialog box would be enter your marks. Okay. And input type, we currently have two types, in text box and multiple choice. But before looking at the multiple choice, let's try the text box here. And here you will give your variable that we discussed in the beginning that Mason has just covered. So in order to create the variable, you can just go to this variable pane and do this thing, or you can directly give a shortcut, try a shortcut that is Control K, and you can just type str input. So that, oh, so it says it's already available. So let's see. Yeah, I think it's already available. If it is not available, you can automatically go ahead and create this. So as I created the input dialog, the next thing is, as this is the if statement, I would like to consider getting this input and doing a simple math calculation using the if statement. So I will again click on the plus icon here and type the if statement. And I will just click on the if statement. So it gives me the if condition. The condition will be str input. So let's say, and I would like to check what is the input variable type is. It is string, which I wanted to be it as an integer, so that I can write the condition properly here. So I will go ahead, str input is greater than 60. So that means if it is more than 60, then I will throw a message saying that the user is passed, or else he has failed the exam and he had to retry. So I will click on this then condition. That means if it is greater than 60, I will type a message box and give the message, congrats, you passed the exam. Or else I will do the same thing by clicking on this plus icon and write a message saying that sorry, you failed the exam, please retry. All right, let's try to run this. In order to run this application, you can either debug the file or you can click on the start icon directly here. Okay, if you click on this, you will get the options here. What are the available options on this pane? So first of all, I would like to do a run. So I will click on run. So it gets compiled in the background and it opens an output pane in the bottom, and it will show you. So it is still compiling the activity. So let's see. Perfect. So here is the input dialog box that has been given. So wantedly, I would like to see whether I'm passed or not. So I will give 50 marks as my input. And it should throw me a message saying that, sorry, you failed the exam, please retry. Perfect. That's what we expected, right? So let's try it one more time and see what it throws now. So I'll input my marks here. Now I will input as 85 and I'll click OK. So now this time it gave me a message saying that congrats, you passed the exam. So that is a simple exercise. Anyone has any doubts, or can I go to the next one? Okay, I think I'll be quick because we only have a couple more minutes. So for the next one, I will take one more, create a new sequence here and type it as switch example. And now this time we will see how to use a switch condition. For that, again, I will try to take an input dialog. And you can give the title, dialog title, and I would like to see, please enter for this example, we would like to see what is the day of a particular given. Let's say the user enters any number, we will show him what is the particular day in the week is. So please enter the number. So I will say I will use some C# commands and environment dot new line. So that means it is going to give it just one space, and I will type 1 as Monday. And I will try this again. Just to speed up your process, you can just copy it and paste it again. And now for 2, you can type as Tuesday. Just as a just keeping the time in mind, we'll just use with these 2 only. So next, what you have to do is so you have to either select the day and entry box. So again, I will select the input. So I will hit Control K. Control K. I will create a new variable, integer day, and just make sure it is an integer variable, because once you create using the variable using Control K, it automatically defaults to string variable. So you can go ahead and update this. Now this time I will be using a switch condition here. So I will pick up the switch condition and I will input the expression as int day here. Okay, and the default scenario will be a message box which says, please select a number. Please select a number between number in either 1 or 2. Okay, and in the new case, what you have to do is, because it is a integer condition, right? You can click on this new case and you will enter the value as 1 and it automatically pops up the next one. So you will drag and drop and it will say it is Monday. And on the case 2, you will type it is Tuesday. It is Tuesday. Okay. So let's try this quickly. So here is the label input box that I got here. So wantedly, I will try to give 3 and it should give me a message saying that please select a number either 1 or 2. This is the default message that we have given, right? So that is what it shows, which is perfect. And let's try one successful scenario just to show you how successful switch case works. So please enter the number. When I enter 1, it should show me Monday. It is Monday. So it is a simple example of the switch condition that I just wanted to share with you. I know we are on the top of the hour. Tracy, do you want to continue with the while, do while, and for too quickly?
I think we're okay for another couple of minutes. I know anybody that needs to, they can drop off. But I find it to complete whatever you'd like.
Sure. I will try the do while now. Also, just to be on the clear side, we will be sharing you the slides where you have a practice exercise so that you can go back and try this within your studio. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help. And going to the next one, we are going to use the do while activity. That means I would like to say whether a particular number is an odd number or an even number. So again, I will try to take an input dialog for the user's input here. And I will tell the user to enter a number. And Control K. And number. And I will get this one. And now I will use a do while loop. So do while loop is a condition that means when the particular condition is met, it automatically breaks the loop and it comes out of that. So I will type do space while, and I will select that. So automatically it is given down there. And now if I would like to put the condition saying that int number mod is not equal to 2, and not equal to 0. So inside this, I will use a condition saying that actually, let's do this inside this input dialog box inside the do while loop, so that I will, whatever the number that I will enter, if it is a even number, it will break out the condition, it will come outside. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And going to the properties pane, I will also try to use an if condition. I'm trying to input an even number here. That means if the modulo 2 of any given number is 0, then it is an even number. If it is not, it is going to be an odd number there. Okay, so let's try the process, and I will trigger this. So the condition should meet is if it is an odd number, it should keep asking the loop again. And if it is an even number that we enter, then it should break out the loop and it should come out. So enter a number. So wantedly, I will enter 5. Then it should say you entered an odd number. And again, without breaking the loop, it is asking me to input another number. Now this time I will input 4, that is an even number. So it has thrown me you entered an even number. It is broke. It should stop the loop. So that's how it is, right? So perfect, it worked. And you also have a practice exercise in your presentation here, where you can go ahead and try this with any kind of lesser numbers or any type of messages that you wanted to try. So you can do that. So, and finally, let's, it's already past 5 minutes. So let's try one for each loop and we will end with that. So for each example, so for this, I would like to use a specific activity called as browse folder. So what it does is it will loop within inside the each folder that I provide, the folder path that I'm going to specify here, and it is going to print all the files that is available within that folder path. So let's take an example of this path, and there are 3 files inside this, right? So I have hard coded the path directly within inside this one. It is throwing a message. Let's see what it is. Okay, let's try using a variable. Control K, str path. And I will also show you an example of how to use an assign activity here. So let's try an assign activity. So I'm going to assign a path variable here. And I will set the value like this. Perfect. Let's try the for each loop. The condition here is for each. Yeah, this one. The good thing about UiPath Studio is if there is any package that is not available, it automatically installs it based on your request, based on the user's request. So that is what is happening right now. And it just takes a little while to add the dependence. And you should understand this is only a one-time process. This is not going to happen every time. So just keep that in mind. Yep, perfect. So now I would like to call this path here within this one. But if you see the argument type, I would like to consider a specific argument type that is file info. So I have to click on the argument, other arguments, and I will type file info here. So you see the system.io.fileinfo, you will select that. And let's print out each specific name. Actually, wait a minute. Let's try this way. One second. Just give me 1 second. Uh, Sorry, I think I messed up something here. 1 second.
Yeah, Naveen, you're not sharing your screen now. I'm not sure if you knew that or not.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you want to build out a demo, you could probably pretty easily post a follow-up video of a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Or you're bound to be under time pressure or anybody has to hang out, so I think it's fine either way. I wouldn't
Yeah, sure.
be worried about it.
Yeah, sorry about that. I thought I would test it out, but with the same example, but it is not working out.
We can do that. We have plenty of more times. If you want to jump on a call, we can do that, or one of the sessions, either tomorrow or the next day if you're available.
Sure,
You can start with that. Yeah.
sure, yeah.
Okay. And then yeah, and just to finish up, thank you, Naveen. Thank you, Tracy, and the team. Andres, I think Mason had to leave a little bit early, but I also want to just say that there is a forum. I put it in chat, just to make sure that you guys always know that we have your back and you can ask any questions you want there. We'll respond to them. So, if there's anything you need, just please let us know. And the forum is a good place to do that at this point. So great. With that, I think we're gonna end this session. And a lot of questions were answered in the chat already through the session. And Tracy, you just put in contact information as well. So appreciate everybody staying here tonight, and we'll see you back tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks.
Session 3. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Hi, guys.